Normandy, summer 1944, the sky smeared with smoke and the roar of artillery rolling across the bocage fields. Amid black haze and flying dirt, a small object flitted low like a golden dragonfly, its thin wings trembling in the wind of gunfire. It was a Piper L-4 Grasshopper, a fabric and steel aircraft with a 65-horsepower engine and a top speed of less than 140 kilometers per hour. It shuddered in the hot updrafts, as if the very sky were mocking its effort to fly. On the ground, American infantrymen looked up and laughed. "Look, the Maytag Messerschmitt." They called it the Messerschmitt made by the washing machine company Maytag. Half in jest, half in pity. According to U.S. Army Air Force's records, in July 1944, forward observation units operated more than 300 liters, 4 seconds in the Normandy area. Their mission was to locate enemy artillery positions, adjust 105 mm fire, and report the movement of German troops. But to the soldiers, the aircraft was a joke, a toy propeller plane fluttering through the sky of the Me-109. If the Germans hit it, at least it'll fall as lightly as a leaf, an artilleryman once wrote in a letter home. Above, Lieutenant Charles W. Lefever gripped the control stick tightly as his L-4 wobbled through slicing gusts of air. The sound of the Continental O-170 engine throbbed like a giant fan. He bent forward, eyes sweeping through binoculars, adjusting coordinates on a folded map laid between his knees. Below, columns of black smoke rose from the town of Saint-Lô, where German guns hidden behind apple trees were firing back fiercely. Each time Lefever descended, the smell of gunpowder and damp earth filled the cockpit, drowning out the crackle of the radio. According to the 9th Air Force Operations Report, July 1944, the intensity of German artillery fire in this area was 8 times higher than the front's average. Any aircraft flying below 500 feet could be shot down in seconds. Yet the L-4 kept circling, so low its shadow ran alongside the earthen ditches. A Spitfire pilot who witnessed it later said after the war, "It looked suicidal, and yet it was beautiful." Inside the cockpit, Lefever stayed silent, his fingers dusted with gunpowder, tapping on the instrument panel. He heard the voice of the battery commander come through the radio. "Adjust fire, grid 417, Baker 2. The signal crackled, but it was clear enough for him to understand. The artillery would fire in his direction. The L-4 tilted slightly right, flying slow enough for him to hear the explosions below. Lefever took a deep breath, then pressed the transmit button. On target, fire for effect. The whistling of shells tore through the air, and the ground below erupted like a storm of fire. In that moment he heard nothing but his heartbeat, and the wind slicing past the frame. And in that silence the Luftwaffe died. The rounds landed so precisely that an entire German platoon was nearly wiped out in 3 minutes, according to the report of the 171st Field Artillery Battery. An observation officer later recalled that afternoon, "It wasn't a fighter, it was a pair of eyes." Every shot that day came from what he saw. The golden light of late day glimmered across the L-4's wings, revealing patches of frayed fabric and oil stains. In that instant, no one laughed anymore. The name Maytag Messerschmitt vanished from the ranks. When Lefever landed on the makeshift grass strip in the fields of Reims, the wind still carried the scent of smoke and scorched earth. He shut off the engine, unbuckled his harness, his hands trembling slightly, but his eyes calm. A mechanic ran up, clapped him on the shoulder. "You made them see, sir." Lefever only nodded, eyes lifted toward the pale, smoky sky. Up there, his L-4 still left a faint curved trail, a trace of a courage no one had believed was real. Normandy still quaked under artillery fire, but amid the chaos, a plane once mocked had proven the impossible. Among the colossal machines of war, it was as small as an idea, yet that very idea, in the hands of a man who dared to believe, changed how Americans looked up at the sky. In 1942, 1943, while the European battlefield was expanding, American artillery still fought based on doctrines inherited from World War I. Artillery units fired according to maps and coordinates passed on by ground scouts or through reports from tactical air forces. According to the U.S. Army Field Artillery Review 1943, the average time from target detection to fire adjustment was 6-8 minutes, enough for German forces to retreat or change position. Americans called it blind fire shots fired blindly through the smoke of the battlefield. On paper, artillery was considered the weapon of science. In reality, it operated like a massive machine without eyes. The reconnaissance missions of the Tactical Air Force were limited by a complicated command hierarchy. Every target required approval through multiple levels. According to statistics from the 9th Air Force Command Report, May 1943, only 1-inch 5 fire support requests were fulfilled within an hour. On the ground, artillery crews could only guess the direction of enemy smoke, listen for counterfire sounds, and adjust through experience. One artillery officer recalled after the war, "We didn't fight the Germans, we fought the fog." Technical limitations made the problem even worse. Radios at the time, the SCR 610 model, weighed over 25 kilograms, with an operating range of only 8-10 kilometers under ideal conditions. When mounted on aircraft, that weight altered the balance of the fabric fuselage, forcing pilots to constantly correct their controls. Paper maps were bulky, frequencies were noisy, and communication links often dropped when planes flew low over trees or hills. According to the Army Signal Corps Technical Report, 1943, as many as 37% of radio signals during reconnaissance flights were completely interrupted. A 30-minute flight could turn into 30 minutes of deadly silence. In the training courses at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, senior officers still believed in the old doctrine. Ground reconnaissance was sufficient for artillery adjustment. Air observation is a luxury, not a necessity, stated an internal memo from 1942 by the Artillery Tactics Office. As a result, thousands of American artillery units entered the front with a narrow field of vision, firing based on estimation and intuition. On the battlefields of Sicily and Italy, every stray shell not only wasted resources but also cost lives among comrades ahead. "We were blind giants," said Lieutenant Edward H. Parker of the 45th Division in a 1947 interview, his voice hoarse and eyes still distant. In contrast, the Germans had found the answer early. They possessed the Fieseler Phi 156 Storch, an observation aircraft capable of taking off and landing within 65 meters of flat ground, flying so slowly that it could hover in the wind while remaining stable. According to the Luftwaffe Operations Summary, 1943, Storch pilots often flew at altitudes of 100–150 meters, transmitting data directly to headquarters through a lightweight radio system. Each German artillery unit had at least one Storch, making their counterfire capability 3 times faster than that of American artillery. This contrast created a bitter paradox. The United States, the most industrially powerful nation in the world, lacked the most fundamental ability to see its targets. In meetings in London in 1943, General Leslie J. Jowse McNair wrote in his report to the War Department, "The Army is not blind because of courage, it is blind because of tradition." That sentence was like a verdict for the entire system. By the end of 1943, at training outposts in England, a group of young engineers and pilots began to ask a question. Was there a way to give artillery eyes in the sky without relying on the Tactical Air Force? They began experimenting with the small Piper L-4 aircraft, originally used for civilian training. The thin fabric frames, knee-high wheels, and weak engines seemed unfit for war. Yet from that fragility, a bold idea was taking shape. In a memorandum dated the 14th of November 1943, Major William W. Ford of the 2nd Artillery Command wrote succinctly, "If we can't see, we can't win. Find me a way to make artillery see." Those words, simple and terse, marked the beginning of a small revolution in American military history. A revolution that began not in factories but on an open field, where the Maytag Messerschmitts were about to prove that victory sometimes comes from things once dismissed as a joke. Before moving on to the next section, If this story resonates with you, please like and share so more people can see it. Share your thoughts in the comments. Every word from you motivates us to create even better videos. Lieutenant Charles W. Lefever did not appear like a silver screen hero, but rather like a craftsman standing beneath the dim lights of a repair workshop. He was born with hands made for fixing more than for speaking on a podium, a mechanical engineer who once worked as a radio repairman before joining the army. In the years before the war, he was familiar with the smell of oil, the hum of engines, and the precision of blueprints, not with the sound of military bands. When the war cast him into the realm of artillery, Lefever carried with him a small but steadfast belief that delicate engineering could save human lives. His engine was not ambition, but loss. After a misfired artillery shell killed his comrades, he saw clearly the price of firing in the dark. From then on, he repeated to his men, "We do not need more guns, we need eyes that think." The phrase was not a slogan, but a declaration of purpose. On a winter night in 1943 at Rheims, as cold wind sliced through rows of tents and the generator hummed steadily, Lefever disassembled a radio, studied a map, then looked at the small L4 with the eyes of a man choosing the right tool for a great task. The starting situation was practical, local, and harsh. An SCR 610 transceiver weighed over 25 kilograms, with a bulky antenna and a steel casing that forced the plane to fly in an awkward position, limited its range, and produced interference that sometimes caused the signal to vanish. Lefever needed no degree in strategy to see the obvious. He only needed his experience as a radio repairman. The weight was too great, the casing too heavy, the antenna too rigid. He loosened each screw on the control panel, feeling the chill of metal, the dust-coated circuits, then set the device down, regarding it like a shackle on the back of a bird. The initial act was symbolic. He took the radio apart, brought it to the corner of the workshop, and began experimenting with lighter materials, new antenna mounts, and arrangements of maps and tools so that a pilot would not have to dive into a ditch to read coordinates. It was the first step in a chain of modifications. According to informal 12th Army Group notes from December 1943, those first alterations were only tests on a single L4, removing the extra seat, tying down cables, and trying a dual antenna setup. But they revealed to Lefever what commanders still hesitated to accept, that a lightweight communication system could turn a small plane into a lifeline for artillery. His belief ran against the current. Sometimes his comrades mocked him, calling his ideas vague or toys. During a campfire meal, when an old officer grumbled about wasting time on training aircraft, Lefever replied curtly, "If they give me 30 pounds of spare weight, I will return 300 yards of accurate range." The words rang out amid whispers, and the clatter of metal not as a loud challenge, but as the pledge of a man who knew how to work. In that moment, Lefever made a small but telling gesture. He lifted a spoonful of cold pudding to his mouth, paused as if caught in thought, the sweetness too sharp against the scent of gunpowder, then smiled faintly and turned back to his plane. It was the micro-reaction of someone who had learned to turn pain into action. That scene was later retold in a small interview, under dim hall lights, scattered applause, and a voice that seemed to carve a memory, a craftsman with weary hands, no grand declarations, yet determined to help the artillery see clearly. Lefever never called himself an inventor. He simply worked. People remembered him for the silence in which he listened to the signals, for eyes that could read the terrain better than numbers could. And in letters sent home, his comrades often ended with a short, simple phrase, a kind of mark, "He made us see." Sometimes, a small belief and a few humble modifications are enough to make an entire theory of war look again. In a temporary workshop just beyond the runway, among a few wooden benches and toolboxes, Lefever began his work like a craftsman who had done it all his life. He did not present grand blueprints. He unscrewed each bolt, removed each cover plate, laid thick steel sheets on the table, and studied them as one would read a map. The first obstacle was the steel casing of the SCR 610 radio unit, weighing 25 kilograms nominally a block of metal that unbalanced the aircraft and caused electromagnetic interference when in contact with the fuselage. Lefever chose an aluminum-magnesium alloy light, yet strong as a replacement, calculating the expansion coefficient, heat dissipation capacity, and the effect of wave reflection on the surface. When his colleagues warned that the move was risky, he merely smiled, glanced at the glowing welding rod in his hand, and kept working. Replacing the casing was only the first step. He rearranged the circuitry, selected capacitors with lower loss factors, and replaced the filter coils to maintain frequency stability under interference. The first results, according to internal experimental records from the 12th Army Group, showed the weight reduced to 11 kilograms while maintaining a stable signal across the same frequency range. This was not merely about making it lighter, it transformed weight into an asset. The small aircraft could now carry the radio without altering its angle of attack or center of mass, freeing the pilot from constant control corrections. A seemingly small but crucial detail was how Lefever handled the antenna. Instead of fixing a short, upright antenna to the fuselage, he stretched a 2.4-meter wire antenna along the wing, secured along a vibration-damping line. This position avoided the electromagnetic shadow cast by the aircraft body and took advantage of the wing's height to reduce ground interference. When transmitting, the signal experienced less reflection from surrounding metal surfaces, and when receiving, the signal strength increased, significantly improving the signal-to-noise ratio. The direct result was a remarkable improvement in communication range. Under field conditions, Lefever recorded successful transmissions up to 20 kilometers, where previously the radio had remained silent. However, the most effective innovation was the synchronization system between the aircraft and the artillery command center. Lefever, together with an artillery officer, tested a short-code transmission method where each correction was sent as a clearly defined short pulse sequence, avoiding prolonged sounds that disrupted the channel. Instead of transmitting long-coded phrases, the pilot would send short signals corresponding to angular and range adjustments, which the artillery command would immediately decode and act upon. According to the unit's experimental report, the average time from target detection to artillery correction decreased from 6 minutes to just 90 seconds. This figure was highlighted in the reports, as it transformed firing from a slow, procedural process into an almost instantaneous response. The system's effectiveness came not only from its hardware but from the integration of mechanical, electronic, and operational structures. Lefever trained pilots to read codes quickly, positioned folded maps within easy reach, and standardized call procedures to eliminate all unnecessary words. According to the 12th Army Group operational notes, December 1943, each adjustment now followed a 3-step pattern, helping artillery units reduce circular error dispersion and pinpoint targets with greater precision. Small techniques and standardized procedures together formed an entirely new system. The real-world impact was evident from the first waves of operation. Thanks to the weight reduction, an L-4 could now take off on a 100-meter strip. What had once been considered luck became repeatable capability. The lighter design allowed the 65-horsepower engine's thrust to be used for climb performance. Lefever measured and recorded an 18% increase in climb rate, enabling the L-4 to escape the danger zone of light anti-aircraft fire. Short landings, gentle braking on wet ground all became safer as weight decreased and mass distribution improved. One afternoon during testing, after assembling the new system, Lefever sat down, hands smeared with sweat and solder, lifting a finger to his lips, tasting the metallic tang as a small habit. An observer later described that moment during a retelling. Dim light in the room, the ticking of an old clock, and a collective sigh from the team. That micro-reaction spoke louder than any chart it was, proof of a man performing something simple yet vital. Lefever's modifications did not turn the L-4 into a fighter plane, but they made it the eyes and voice of artillery, a tool of precise coordination. Frontline reports recorded that after adopting the improvements, target correction efficiency increased, ammunition consumption decreased, and response time shortened significantly. In war, victory sometimes lies in doing an old task in a new way, And Lefever achieved that through humble yet deliberate steps, by listening to the whisper of machines and giving them a clear voice on the battlefield. Morning of the 11th of July 1944, Saint-Lô was still a labyrinth of ruins. The narrow streets had been churned by artillery fire, and the walls of houses collapsed into piles of white bricks streaked with mud and smoke. Above, the L-4 seconds of the observation unit circled like small birds over a sea of fire. One of them bore the marking, "Lefever set inside." The aircraft Lieutenant Charles W. Lefever had modified with his own hands. Below, the 171st Field Artillery Battalion awaited orders. A cluster of German Panzer IV tanks lay concealed behind the bocage west of Saint-Lô, preparing to counterattack the D7 roadway, a vital link connecting the US 7th Corps. The L4 trembled lightly as Lefever pushed the throttle forward, the propeller scattering gun smoke rising from the ground. At an altitude of 500 feet, hot air rising from the ruins made the airframe sway. He adjusted the newly installed radio, hearing the artillery commander's voice break through explosions. "Fire mission, grid 270, 2 Able 1. The tone sounded as if from another world, quivering through electric veins. Lefever replied firmly, "Spotter airborne," ready to adjust. He pulled the control stick slightly, and the L4 banked left, its 2.4-meter antenna vibrating softly like a string under tension. According to the after-action report, 9th Army Air Forces, July 1944, the Saint-Lô area was one of the densest artillery zones in Europe, averaging 30 German guns per square kilometre. Electromagnetic interference, smoke, and the bocage terrain made all radio communication a trial. Yet Lefever's modified radio maintained a clear signal. According to the 171st Field Artillery log, July 11, Lefever identified the coordinates in 47 seconds and corrected the first salvo. From low altitude, he saw each streak of red tracer fire cross the apple rows, falling slowly like glimmers of light through mist. The first salvo missed by about 80 meters. He transmitted the correction. Add 100, right 50. The artillery answered with a dry burst of explosions. The second time, the smoke rose closer. Lefever adjusted again. Drop 25, fire for effect. The sky erupted in dozens of white flashes, columns of smoke curling upward. He clearly saw one Panzer IV flip over, orange fire bursting across its turret. With just 4 salvos, the entire tank formation vanished behind a wall of flame. It was like watching a god drawing circles with fire. An American gunner later recounted in a 1946 interview. In Wehrmacht battlefield reports, German soldiers noted that American artillery achieved unusual precision, as if there were eyes in the sky. Several units reported being struck by an air strike of unknown origin, mistaking the L4 for a light attack aircraft. One prisoner later testified, "We thought the Americans had found a new bomber, silent and deadly." That sense of confusion spread quickly through the German defense network in Normandy, where even the smallest change in observation could unravel an entire front line. That afternoon, Lefever flew 5 missions, each lasting about 40 minutes, adjusting artillery for batteries along the Vire River. By the next dawn, Saint-Lô was no longer a refuge. In 2 days, Lefever's team called in artillery that destroyed 19 Panzer force, 6 gun positions, and crippled 3 German supply routes, according to the U.S. Army Ground Forces Bulletin, August 1944. Every mission was completed without the loss of a single L4. After the battle, Lefever returned to the temporary base in thin rain. He stepped down from his plane, his jacket covered in dust and the smell of gunpowder. A young soldier handed him a cup of coffee and, with trembling voice, asked, "Sir, how did you see through that smoke?" Lefever looked past the doorway, where the town was still veiled in haze, and replied quietly, "I didn't. The radio did." The answer was short, dry, as the sound of wind through wires, but it silenced everyone. They understood that the miracle had not come from luck, but from a craftsman who could hear the language of machines and turn it into the eyes of artillery. That evening, when Lefever wrote his report to command, he noted simply, "Test successful. communication stable, adjustment time reduced to 90 seconds. Amid the terse lines, a small blot of ink spread where a raindrop had fallen. The oil lamp's light reflected on a small photo pinned beside the page, an L-4 amid smoke, its wings tilted like a gesture of respect. In that silence, the war paused for a breath, and through the rhythm of rain striking the tin roof, Lefever murmured, "Let them see." Saint-Lô would later become a symbol of the rebirth of American artillery. A fragile plane, a radio weighing half the original, and an engineer who knew how to listen had made the Corps' firepower more accurate than ever before. The guns on the ground no longer fired blindly, and soldiers began to believe in what once seemed impossible. In the thick smoke of battle, amid the scent of burning metal and wet earth, the baptism of smoke was not just one man's initiation, it was the birth of a concept, artillery that could see. News of victory from Saint-Lô spread faster than the smoke of artillery. Within 3 weeks after that battle, reports from artillery units began recording the same phenomenon. Target adjustment time had dropped sharply, firing efficiency had surged, and incidents of friendly fire had nearly disappeared. According to the War Department Ordnance Review, August 1944, the results of testing in Normandy were deemed a doctrinal turning point. In September 1944, the War Department officially approved an expansion program. 1,500 litres, 4 and L-5 aircraft were assigned to infantry, armoured, and artillery divisions across Europe and the Pacific. AOP, Air Observation Post. Training centres were established in England, France, and Italy, where new pilots learned to read maps from the air, fly low through hostile fire, and transmit concise coordinates over the radio. Lefever was invited to serve as technical advisor for the program, teaching the rapid correction method based on the improved radio system. According to the Army Air Force's Training Command Report, 1944, the training time for an AOP pilot was reduced from 10 weeks to 6 weeks, thanks to lightweight equipment and standardized communication procedures. Gone were the days of hopeless waiting between ground units now. Every artillery battery had a pair of eyes in the sky. According to the War Department Evaluation Summary, 1,945 artillery units equipped with reconnaissance aircraft achieved a 43% increase in accuracy and a 30% reduction in average ammunition expenditure. Behind those dry numbers lay thousands of lives saved, enemy positions destroyed after only a few salvos, and a marked increase in the speed of advance. From Reims to Ardennes, American gun crews began firing as if holding binoculars instead of 105mm guns. "It wasn't luck," said one artilleryman in a post-war interview. "It was eyes in the sky." The strategic impact did not stop there. Having a network of reconnaissance aircraft at the battalion level allowed American artillery to do what the enemy never expected: conduct real-time precision counterfire. While German radar still relied on tracking shell trajectories, the L-4 could transmit coordinates in under 90 seconds. During Operation Market Garden, observation aircraft helped identify 72% of enemy artillery positions before German forces could relocate. Each successful transmission unleashed a chain of counter-battery fire so rapid and accurate that German units believed the Americans were using guided weapons. The very way of fighting changed. AOP pilots were no longer merely flyers. They became airborne spotters, commanders in the sky who read terrain, assessed targets, and coordinated artillery in real time. They operated close to the front lines, sometimes flying as low as 200 feet, where air turbulence from artillery shells could shake the plane's frame violently. Yet from that vantage point, they saw everything. During the Rhine Crossing campaign in March 1945, each American division was assigned at least 2 AOP squadrons. According to the U.S. 9th Army Operation Record, 1945, within 48 hours, American artillery destroyed 216 hardened targets and nearly 400 defensive positions, most of which had been identified by reconnaissance pilots. The most concrete tactical effect was seen at Bastogne in the winter of 1944. When Frost and German artillery encircled the entire area, 7 L-4 pilots maintained continuous observation for 62 hours, taking turns flying from narrow clearings in the Ardennes forest. They transmitted the coordinates of every German gun nest, every 88mm battery, to the artillery units behind. According to the after-action report, 101st Airborne Division, more than 60 German artillery positions were destroyed thanks to L-4 guidance, helping sustain the American defensive ring until reinforcements arrived. One eyewitness recalled, "We looked up and saw that little plane circling above. As long as it was there, we knew we weren't alone." The L-4 pilots carried no weapons and wore no armor, yet each time they took off, the entire artillery force behind them gained a new pair of eyes. When Lefever received the first report from St. Lo, he simply said, "Now they can see." That sentence spread across training centers, painted on walls in briefing rooms, becoming an unofficial motto. As the war entered its final phase, generals began to realize that what changed the course of battle was not just the number of weapons, but how people learned to connect them. "When the sky learned to aim," wrote the Army Ordnance Journal in early 1946, "the ground learned how to win." The L-4 Grasshoppers, once dismissed as toys, had become the all-seeing eyes of modern artillery, and in every report, one simple line appeared again and again: "Communication by Lefever set." Somewhere on the once scorched fields of Normandy, a small idea had transformed a great doctrine. The sky had learned to aim, and from that moment on, every American artillery shell carried within it the mark of a quiet engineer's hand. When the guns fell silent in the spring of 1945, the L-4 Grasshoppers were lined up one by one on the grassy fields of temporary airstrips, their silver paint fading under the Sunday. Beside one of them lay a photograph taken by a war correspondent of the 9th Army, Lieutenant Charles W. Lefever standing upright, his hand resting lightly on the wing frame, his gaze calm. On the nose of the plane, a rough white inscription stood out, "Lefever set inside." No one knew who had written it, only that from then on, the phrase became a quiet tribute among artillerymen. It never appeared in tactical reports, but it was found scrawled on the walls of repair shops in Reims, Bastogne, and along the Rhine. In post-war summaries, Lefever's name nearly vanished from the rolls of honor. There were no medals, no ceremonies. He was listed as a temporary technician under the heading Field Radio Modification, a faint line buried deep in the technical appendix of the War Department Report 1946. A man who had served with him recalled in a 1952 interview, "He was there every morning, tuning signals, making sure the sky could talk, but in the records, he's just a number." That number was 12171RC, the designation for the experimental radio group in France. According to post-war statistics, the communication system Lefever modified served in more than 30,000 artillery observation flights from 1944 to 1945, helping adjust over 400,000 shells and saving thousands of lives. On each of those flights, the 11 kg lightweight radio continued to operate reliably amid explosions and shock waves, carrying the voices of observers who were redefining modern tactics. An engineer from the Signal Corps, in a memoir published in 1948, wrote, "It was not a new radio, it was a new rhythm. The air learned to speak in code and silence." After the war, Lefever was assigned to the Army Signal Corps Engineering Center at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. His office was small, its window overlooking the lawn where recruits practiced coiling antenna wire. He spoke little, did not lecture, and simply adjusted equipment in quiet focus. According to the Signal Corps Laboratory Report 1947, Lefever joined the research group, improving the handheld SCR-300 radio, the prototype ancestor of later tactical communication systems. The principles he established, reducing weight, increasing frequency stability, simplifying transmission handling, became the foundation for an entire generation of modern military radio technology. A black and white photograph preserved in the Fort Monmouth archives shows Lefever holding an open radio circuit board beside a small hand-annotated schematic labeled Field Tested Reims 1000 943. The corner of the paper is scorched, likely from a cigarette. A librarian once described, "He spoke like a man recalling an old song, one note at a time, slow and steady." Perhaps he knew his work no longer needed attention, for the real legacy had already taken flight, carried by the Lefever seconds that once rose through flares and black smoke. The human value in this story lies not in invention, but in an attitude toward war. Lefever never called his radio a weapon. To him it was a bridge of sound. Each time a signal connected, it meant one more gun saw clearly, one more infantry unit moved closer to safety. According to the U.S. Army Ground Forces Bulletin, 1,945 artillery units with AOP pilots using the modified radios achieved 43% greater accuracy and suffered 28% fewer casualties. Those numbers may look like data, but to Lefever, they were breaths saved amid smoke and steel. In his later years, he rarely spoke of the war. People said that each afternoon he sat in his backyard, watching kites drift across the New Jersey sky. When neighbors asked, he would answer, "They still fly higher than I did," a half-joking, half-true remark containing both pride and humility. Once, an old comrade came to visit, bringing a fragment of the L-4's wing fabric that remained, the painted words, "Lefever set inside," still visible. Lefever stayed silent for a long time, then said, "Keep it. It belongs to everyone who ever looked up." In 1953, when the tactical radio program AN divided by PRC was introduced, an internal report from the Army Signal Corps cited principles from Lefever Modification Field Notes, 1943. That citation was his final mark in military records. Afterward, Lefever's name disappeared from all official lists, but the technical legacy did not. Later, systems of tactical positioning, from ground radar to field communication networks, were built upon the philosophy of stable, lightweight, and independent transmission. In 1978, at the 35th anniversary ceremony of the Air Observation Post at Fort Rucker, a former AOP pilot addressed a hall full of young officers. He never wanted to be remembered, but we remember anyway. The amber light shone upon Lefever's old photograph, the faded silver frame reflecting the silent rows of uniforms. When the archival film played the scene of an L-4 flying over St. Lo, the announcer said, "This is the moment when artillery learned to see." And at the back of the hall, in silence, an old L-4 pilot from Bastonia bowed his head and whispered to himself, "The sky never left the ground, it just stayed in our hands." That sentence became the title of a later documentary by the Army Historical Division, "The Sky That Never Left the Ground," a testament that Lefever's legacy did not reside in the sky, but in humanity's capacity to see. Today, each time an artillery officer lifts a hand over a modern communication device, they are touching the memory of an unnamed engineer. Every transmitted signal, every satellite-corrected map, echoes the distant hum of an L-4 trembling in the smoke above Normandy. And somewhere in the quiet of history, one can still hear the faint hiss of a radio and the steady voice of the silent engineer. On target. Fire for effect. The war ended, but the meaning of small things still hovers between human memories. From the dirt runways of Normandy to the laboratory rooms at Fort Monmouth, Lefever's story is a reminder that not all victories come from strength. Some battles are decided by perseverance, and an idea no one believed possible. According to the War Department summary, 1946, Lefever's radio modification helped reduce the average artillery response time by 30% across the European front. Yet behind that number lies a deeper question. What made a radio technician believe he could teach the sky to speak? What was once a joke became a legacy. From Maytag Messerschmitt, the crude mockery of American soldiers, to Lefever set inside, those two phrases mark a quiet journey from ridicule to respect. The men who once called the L-4 a flying washing machine later wrote in their memoirs that they never forgot that low hum above them whenever enemy shells began to fall. That sound meant we were not blind anymore, Lieutenant Edward Parker wrote in a 1945 letter to Lefever. When a small plane could help an entire division see more clearly, the very concept of strength was redefined. Perhaps in every era there are ideas laughed at before they are understood. Lefever had no speech, no moment under victory fireworks, yet each of his inventions was an act of faith. That intelligence needs no noise, only the chance to take flight. He flew through a sky thick with doubt and, with a persistence bordering on stubbornness, turned it into proof that sometimes wars are won by details. In the end, it was not the bombers that changed artillery, it was a whisper, wrote the Army Ordnance Journal in 1947. That story makes us wonder, have you ever had an idea others laughed at, something too small, too naive, or not big enough to be taken seriously? If so, would you dare to take flight like Lefever did, with the belief that the world doesn't need more explosions, but more eyes willing to see farther? His L-4 could only climb to 2,000 feet, yet its impact had no limit. Those who lived through the war said they still remembered the glimmer of the propellers as the sun set over Saint-Lô, a faint but unwavering light. It wasn't as brilliant as flares, but it lasted longer. That glow, one artilleryman said, was hope disguised as noise. Lefever had turned the sound of a tiny plane into a signal of life, and when the smoke-filled sky finally cleared, what remained were not the wrecked tanks or the ruins, but faith in human capability that amid chaos, someone still chose to do the most meticulous work of all, helping others see more clearly. Today, as we look back on wars in history, it's easy to forget that every technical innovation began with doubt. But within that doubt, intelligence is tested and courage is proven. Lefever's innovation not only saved artillerymen's lives but rekindled faith that technology exists not to destroy but to understand one another better. Amid today's world filled with signals and data, that principle remains unchanged. To transmit sound is engineering. To make someone truly hear is humanity. If this story makes you believe that small things can lead to great change, that an anonymous craftsman's hand can alter the course of a battlefield, share your thoughts. Every follow or comment is more than a reaction. It's a reminder that people like Lefever are not forgotten. History needs those who can look closely at details and turn them into direction, just as he did in the darkest days of the century. Now, the L-4 seconds lie rusting in military depots, their silver paint flaking, their wings tilted in museums. But the sky they opened, the sky of intellect, courage, and survival, still lives on in every radio signal, every electronic map, every navigation system we use to understand the world. And if one day you hear the wind whisper, like the faint hum of a small engine over an old field, imagine it as a greeting from a quiet engineer, the man who taught the sky to see, and taught humanity to believe in what once seemed impossible. Have you ever lived through the echoes of war, the sirens, the gunpowder smell, or the memory of someone who never returned? If this story touches you, follow and share your thoughts below. Tell me what you've witnessed or heard about war. Every memory, no matter how small, is part of a history we must never let fade. May stories like this never be forgotten, so future generations understand that peace is not natural, it is a gift paid for with sweat, tears, and the courage of ordinary people. A single like from you today may help keep that memory alive, so that the sky Lefever once looked upon, the sky of faith, intellect, and survival, will forever remain in the hearts of those who have never forgotten the past.